We have already told you, on this channel, of a lonely island and an enchantress who lived upon it, and a wandering hero named Odysseus, who came to her shores and was turned, along with his crew, into a herd of pigs before he ever learned her name. We told that story from his side of it, a dangerous obstacle on a long road home, defeated by a magic herb and a god's warning, transformed at last from an enemy into an unexpected and generous host. Tonight, we are going to tell the same island's story from the other direction, and follow the woman who lived there for far longer than any single hero's visit, before Odysseus ever arrived, and long after he finally sailed away. This is the story of Circe, and it begins, as the stories of so many powerful women in these old tales so often do, with a family that never quite knew what to do with a daughter more gifted and more dangerous than anyone in it had ever expected her to become. Circe was a daughter of Helios, the god of the sun himself, one of the sea nymph daughters of Oceanus, which made her, by blood, immortal from the very moment of her birth, a goddess in her own right rather than any ordinary mortal woman who might later be granted divine favor or divine punishment. And her family, spread across the whole of the ancient world in these old tales, was a formidable one. Her brother was Aeaea, the very king of Glaucus, whose fire-breathing, bulls, and sown dragon's teeth this channel has already described in the long telling of Jason and the Argonauts. This is the same king who set Jason his impossible trial, and whose own daughter, Circe's niece, was Medea, the sorceress whose story this channel has also already told, in all its tragic and terrible detail. It is worth pausing on this bloodline before the story moves any further, because it tells us something important about the particular kind of power Circe carried in her from birth. She came from a family whose women, generation after generation, seemed to possess an unusually close and unusually dangerous relationship with the darker arts of enchantment. Medea's sorcery did not spring from nowhere. It ran in the family, and Circe, older than her niece by at least a generation, was among the very first to demonstrate exactly how far that inherited gift could reach when a woman who possessed it decided to use it without restraint. The old tellings differ on exactly what first drove Circe into the long and solitary exile that would define the whole rest of her existence, but the most common account holds that she had been married at some point in her early divine life to a mortal prince of some Scythian kingdom, and that she came, in time, to despise him so thoroughly that she used her own considerable skill with poisons and potions to end his life, the first, but by no means the last, demonstration this story offers us of exactly how dangerous her particular gift could become, once turned against someone who had earned or simply provoked her displeasure. For this crime, her own people drove her into exile, unwilling to keep among them a woman capable of dispatching an inconvenient husband, with nothing more than a carefully prepared cup of wine, and she was sent, alone, to a remote and isolated island called Aeaea, far from the company of any other gods or any other mortals, to live out the whole of her long and immortal existence in a solitude that few beings in these old tales, divine or otherwise, were ever actually condemned to endure for quite so long. It is worth sitting with the particular shape of that early exile, because it sets the stage for everything that follows in a way the story of her Odyssey cameo, which this channel has already told, does not fully explain on its own. Circe did not arrive on Aeaea, a stranger to power, nor a woman recently, and suddenly discovering some new and unfamiliar gift. She arrived already formidable, already willing, when sufficiently provoked, to use her skill in ways that crossed the line from self-defense into something considerably darker. And she arrived, above all, already alone, cast out by her own family and her own people for exactly the kind of unrestrained power that would go on, across the centuries of solitary exile that followed, to grow only more complete and more dangerous the longer it went entirely unchecked by any other company at all. Picture what such an exile must have actually meant for an immortal being, since the ordinary comforts of mortal grief, a life that eventually ends, a sorrow that eventually fades with the passage of enough seasons, were never available to her at all. A mortal woman driven into exile might, in time, grow old and make some kind of peace with her isolation, or simply run out of years in which to keep suffering it. Circe had no such mercy waiting for her anywhere on the horizon. She would be alone on Aeaea not for a decade, and not for a single mortal lifetime, but for as long as her own divine nature continued, which was to say, in the plain and terrible arithmetic of immortality, forever, unless something or someone eventually intervened to change the shape of that endless solitude. It is worth holding this fact quietly in mind as her story continues, because every single choice she makes across the centuries that follow is a choice made by someone with no natural end in sight to whatever pattern she settled into. No aging body to eventually soften her judgment, no approaching death to eventually humble her pride. Only the same island, the same herbs, and the same accumulating weight of centuries spent almost entirely alone. And it was in the isolation of that same long exile, well before Odysseus's ship ever appeared on her horizon, that Circe's story produced one of its darkest and most revealing chapters. The tale of Scylla, whose own transformation this channel has already mentioned in passing, in the telling of Odysseus's long journey home, without ever explaining exactly how a beautiful sea nymph came to become the six-headed horror that devoured 6 of his men in a single terrible passage. The story, as it is usually told, begins with Glaucus, a fisherman transformed into a minor sea god, after eating a strange and magical herb that granted him immortality and the power to live beneath the waves, who fell deeply and hopelessly in love with a beautiful nymph named Scylla, who lived along a rocky and treacherous stretch of coastline, and wanted nothing at all to do with his awkward and unwelcome affection. Desperate and unable to win her favor through his own persuasion, Glaucus traveled to the island of Aeaea to seek out Circe, whose reputation for powerful love potions and transformative magic had already spread across the whole of the ancient world. Hoping the Enchantress might brew him something that would finally soften Scylla's cold and unmoved heart toward him. But Circe, meeting Glaucus and hearing his desperate plea, found herself in a reversal that the old poets clearly meant us to notice as deeply and bitterly ironic, falling in love with the very sea god who had come to her seeking a potion for someone else entirely. She offered herself to him instead, urging him to forget the cold and unwelcoming Scylla and turn his own affection toward a goddess who would actually return it in full. But Glaucus, faithful to his own hopeless infatuation, despite every reasonable argument Circe could offer him, refused her completely, declaring that he would love Scylla and no one else, for as long as the sea itself continued to move and the trees continued to grow upon the hills. It is worth noticing here the particular symmetry the story has quietly constructed. Circe, offering genuine devotion to a man who could not see past his own fixed and unmovable infatuation with someone else, in almost exact mirror of the scorn Scylla herself had shown Glaucus only a short while before. Rejection, in this particular story, does not simply end with the person who suffers it. It travels past from one heart to the next, each rejected lover, finding in turn someone else's heart to break in their own bitter frustration. And Circe, humiliated and furious at being refused so completely by a man she had genuinely wanted, did not direct her anger at Glaucus himself, whose steady and unwavering devotion to another woman, however inconvenient it was to her own desires, was hardly a crime deserving punishment. She turned her fury instead upon Scylla, the innocent and entirely uninvolved object of Glaucus's affection, a woman who had done nothing at all except decline an unwanted suitor's advances, exactly as she had every right to do. Circe traveled to the pool where Scylla bathed each day, and poured into its waters a potion brewed from poisonous and monstrous herbs. And when Scylla stepped into the water, exactly as she always did, the potion took terrible effect, and her lower body began to twist and multiply into a writhing mass of ravenous, barking dog-heads. Her once lovely form transformed permanently into the six-headed horror that this channel has already described, devouring sailors from the deck of Odysseus's own ship. Generations later, in the strait she still guards to this very day. Scylla, horrified at what she had become, fled into the sea and made her home in the dangerous rocks, where Odysseus would one day find her, forever separated from any hope of ordinary love or ordinary companionship, punished entirely and completely for a rejection she had every right to offer, and had done nothing whatsoever to deserve suffering for. There is a particular and uncomfortable lesson worth sitting with in this story, because it complicates considerably whatever picture we might otherwise have carried away from Circe's later and more sympathetic appearance in the tale of Odysseus. This was not a single moment of understandable weakness or momentary loss of temper. This was a goddess, spurned in love, choosing to permanently and monstrously disfigure an entirely innocent rival, rather than simply accept a rejection that had nothing at all to do with any fault of her own. It is worth remembering, too, that this is the very same pattern this channel has already followed once before, in the tragic story of Medea, a woman of this same gifted and dangerous bloodline, whose love, once betrayed or thwarted, turned with terrifying speed into a capacity for destruction that reached far beyond the person who had actually wronged her. Circe's transformation of Scylla is, in its own way, Medea's murder of her own children told a generation earlier, in a different key, with a different innocent victim, standing in the place of Jason's own sons. The same families, same dangerous inheritance, expressing itself, this time, not against a faithless lover directly, but against the blameless woman who had simply happened to be loved by him instead of her. The old Roman poet, Ovid, retelling this same story, centuries later, adds one further and equally telling chapter to Circe's long history of love turned to vengeance, and it is worth including here, for it shows the same pattern repeating itself with an almost eerie consistency across the whole span of her long immortal life. In this later tale, Circe fell in love with a mortal king of Italy named Picus, a man already faithfully and happily married, to a nymph named Canens, whose singing voice, the old poets tell us, was so beautiful it could charm rivers to change their courses and wild beasts to grow still and calm simply to listen. Circe, encountering Picus while he was out hunting, tried every enchantment and every persuasion at her disposal to win him for herself, and Picus, exactly as faithful to his own wife as Glaucus had once been faithful to Scylla, refused her completely. And Circe, exactly as she had once done to the innocent object of Glaucus's affection, did not accept the refusal gracefully. She transformed Picus himself this time, rather than his beloved, striking him with her wand, and turning the faithful king into a woodpecker, condemned to fly the forests forever in that diminished shape rather than ever again, returned to the wife who loved him and waited, in vain, for a husband who would never come home to her in his own true form again. There is a detail in the Picus story worth pausing over a moment longer, because it deepens the cruelty of the transformation in a way that is easy to miss on a first hearing. Canens, the faithful wife left behind, did not simply mourn her vanished husband and move on with whatever remained of her own life. She searched for him across the Italian countryside for 6 days and 6 nights without pause, calling his name until her own voice, the very voice once so beautiful it could turn rivers from their courses, wasted away entirely from grief and exhaustion, until she herself dissolved into nothing more than air and echo beside the banks of a river that has carried her name ever since. Circe's punishment of Picus, in other words, did not end with him. It reached past him entirely, to destroy the innocent woman he loved, exactly as her punishment of Scylla had once reached past Glaucus, to destroy the woman he loved instead of her. It is the same shape of cruelty, told twice, centuries apart, and it is worth noticing that in neither case did Circe's fury ever actually land on the man who had refused her. It always found its way, instead, to the woman standing beside him. Notice, across both of these stories, exactly what remains constant in Circe's particular pattern of behavior, because it tells us something important about the woman Odysseus would eventually encounter on her island many years later. She is not a goddess who simply enjoys cruelty for its own sake, the way some of the darker figures in these old tales seem to. Her transformations, in every single instance the old poets give us, spring directly from thwarted love, a genuine and powerful desire, offered honestly and refused, that curdles, with a speed and a totality that should by now feel disturbingly familiar to anyone who has followed her niece Medea's own story on this channel into a devastating need to punish someone, anyone, for the unbearable experience of having been unwanted. It is a pattern the story does not excuse and should not be read as excusing, but it is worth understanding clearly, nonetheless, because it changes, in an important way, exactly how we ought to read what happens next, when a very different kind of man finally washes up on her shore. For when Odysseus arrived at Aeaea, this channel has already told you, Circe transformed his men into swine almost immediately upon their arrival, exactly the kind of casual and overwhelming display of power this same pattern would lead us to expect from a goddess with her particular history. But Odysseus himself, protected by the herb moly that Hermes gave him, and the sword he drew when her wand failed against him, resisted her transformation entirely, becoming, in that single moment, something Circe had apparently never quite encountered before, across the whole of her long and solitary exile, a man she could not simply overpower, bend, or punish according to her own accustomed pattern. And it is worth noticing what she did instead, once that pattern had finally, genuinely failed her. She did not respond with the same fury that had transformed Scylla and Picus. She yielded and welcomed him and restored his transformed men, and the two of them, goddess and mortal hero, remained together on her island for a full year, in a relationship that the old poems describe with none of the coercion or bitterness that had defined every one of her earlier and more famous entanglements. It is worth asking honestly what actually changed, because the contrast is genuinely striking. once both halves of her story are set side by side. Perhaps it is simply that Odysseus, unlike Glaucus or Picus, was never asked to reject her at all. He arrived already resistant to her power, and by the time any real intimacy developed between them, it grew from a position of genuine mutual respect rather than from one party's overwhelming and unrefusable desire crashing against another's unmovable devotion to someone else. Or perhaps, and this reading is worth sitting with too, an immortal woman who had spent so many centuries alone on a single island. Meeting only sailors she could transform into animals, or immortal lovers who refused her outright, had simply never before had the chance to know what an actual equal partnership might feel like, and found herself, when Odysseus finally offered her exactly that, more willing to build something lasting than to punish him the way she had once punished everyone else who had ever failed to want her back. When Odysseus finally prepared to leave her island and continue his own long journey home, Circe did not curse him, or transform him, or attempt to hold him against his will the way her earlier history might have led us to expect. She helped him instead. This channel has already told you, giving him the crucial guidance he needed to survive the journey still ahead of him. The warning about the siren's song, the terrible choice between Scylla and Charybdis, the instruction that would eventually lead him down into the land of the dead to consult the blind prophet Tiresias. It is a strange and quietly moving detail, easy to overlook amid the larger drama of Odysseus's own famous journey, that the very passage past Scylla's monstrous rocks, which Circe herself had once created out of jealous fury so many years before, was one of the very dangers she now, in an entirely different frame of mind, carefully warned her mortal lover how to survive. And so we return at the end to the question this long and complicated story was quietly built to ask. Was Circe a monster, or a victim, or something more difficult and more honest than either of those simple labels can fully hold? She was exiled by her own people for a crime that was genuinely hers to answer for. She disfigured an entirely innocent woman out of nothing more than her own wounded pride, not once but, by some tellings, twice over in different centuries and different shapes. And she was also, this channel has already shown you, capable of genuine partnership and genuine and unselfish generosity. Once she finally met someone who did not simply become one more name added to her long list of either conquests or refusals. Circe's whole long story, gathered together across every one of these separate episodes, refuses the comfort of a single clean verdict, and perhaps that refusal is exactly the point. Power, wielded across centuries of total isolation, with no one at all to answer to, and no one at all to hold it accountable, does not simply harden into either pure cruelty or pure benevolence. It remains, across every single one of Circe's long immortal centuries, capable of becoming either one, depending entirely on who happens to wash up on her shore and what they are brave or fortunate enough to offer her in return. Rest now. Let the old island of Aeaea settle into its long and quiet solitude once more, its herbs and its potions resting undisturbed on their shelves, and somewhere on its shore, if the story is kind to her at last, let its goddess finally rest too, no longer alone, no longer needing to prove, through any wand or any poisoned cup, exactly how much power a single unwanted heart can hold.